those who could or may in the future be acting illegally. Thank you.
I call Dr. Duncan Webb.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a more in sadness than in anger. I saw Todd McClay there rise and sort of try and bag this bill, because I must say he's such a decent fellow at Select Committee. It was really good. It was a really good Select Committee, and we made, I think, some excellent progress here, and well chaired by Mr O'Connor almost all of the time as well. This is actually, you can refer to peaceniks and what have you, but this really is an important part of the network of steps that are being taken to make sure that the illicit trade in arms is stopped. And as the member would know, this is in fact part of our international obligations under the Arms Trade Treaty, which was ratified in 2014, a United Nations treaty which comes straight out of the Office for Disarmament Affairs. And if we look at that, the purpose of that is it goes right to the heart of what the United Nations is about, the maintenance of peace and security. And that really is what we're seeking to achieve here, to make sure that New Zealand does not, by accident, become a place from where arms brokering occurs. Now, there's no suggestion, and we were very reliably informed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, that arms brokering is a very small activity in New Zealand indeed, that there's perhaps one or two people who are in fact genuine arms brokers. Having said that, we need to take these steps to ensure that we have the same kind of robust regulatory frameworks around arms brokering to make sure that New Zealand doesn't indeed become that. So there's no great sophisticated industry. This isn't some gun runners or war dogs bill. And in fact, it may well be that there is some items which are quite legitimately traded. And one of the things this bill does is it balances that. As the United Nations Treaty does, this bill also recognises the ability of sovereign nation states to ensure their own security within the realm of conventional weapons. And also the other thing it does, which in fact goes beyond the treaty, is it recognises the fact that there are dual-use goods, a whole list, an enormous list of items which have perfectly legitimate civilian uses, and in fact many of the high-tech items have very, very important civilian uses, but put to the wrong use, they can also have military applications. And there's a balance to be struck there between ensuring that people aren't accidentally caught by this legislation, but at the same time making sure that we don't have an industry in New Zealand of identifying these high-tech goods and then arranging sales, purchase and sales in overseas countries. Because arms brokering, as Honourable Minister Parker said, is not about sales from New Zealand. It's about arranging transactions overseas between two overseas parties, Madam Speaker. So, the object of this bill and the object of the treaty, which flows from the treaty, is to prevent and eradicate illicit trade in arms. And we know that's important because we know a lot of strife and armed conflict in the world today would not be possible but for the fact of the porous nature of the arms trade. So what we're trying to do is have a solid wall of defence across a multilateral, and this is a government that wants to act multilaterally and has a multilateral approach to the restrictions in the arms trade, whether that be actual arms dealing, which is one thing, or arms broking, which is what we're concerned with here today. So that's the very, very important thing that we're doing here today. And I must say the Select Committee did work well. The bill as it came to us, I think we would all agree around that committee table that there was some room for improvement. And as the Minister, Honourable Winston Peters, said, the improvements are mainly technical. They don't go to the heart of the bill, but they are important. They were important because they went to things like burden of proof. They went to the outline of the offences. And another matter that they went to was, in fact, extraterritoriality. This is a bill which, by its very nature, because it concerns transactions which occur overseas, has an extraterritorial element. And it is quite extraordinary for a nation, a sovereign state like New Zealand, to say we are going to create a regulatory regime and criminal offences which have reach overseas. So we've always got to be very cautious about that. And as it was initially drafted, it had an extraordinary element, and that was that it appeared to achieve universal jurisdiction. That is to say that if an offence occurred overseas, whoever did it, wherever they did it, whenever they did it, New Zealand could, in fact, go and enforce its law against the citizen of another state. And that's an extraordinary power. It does exist in some small areas. Crimes of piracy and slavery are the classic examples, but it was not considered that this was appropriate because this is essentially a regulatory offence. It's an offence about engaging in an illicit commercial activity, not entirely dissimilar to drug brokering or something of that ilk. So when we think about the justification for universal jurisdiction, it wasn't there. So when we looked at Section 33 of the bill, we noted that to have an ability to arrest, detain and charge someone who wasn't a New Zealand citizen for activities that occurred in a foreign nation, it wasn't appropriate, it wasn't fit for purpose, and it's good to see that that suggestion has been adopted. The other thing about this bill is that its scope is broad in terms of the arms and items it covers. The strategic goods list, I invite those who are, suffer from a lack of sleep to go and read it, because it is 300 pages of different items. Whilst the first 30-odd pages are guns and tanks and what have you, the other 100 and whatever pages is all kinds of items of high technology, whether it be avionics, whether it be the Kevlar vests, navigation systems, chemicals and toxins, and so on and so forth. It just goes on and on. Now, importantly, people who trade in those goods without realising that they are in fact restricted goods won't be liable to prosecution, as long as they believe they're going to be put to legitimate civilian uses. So there are a number of situations where you won't require registration under this Act. One won't require registration. That is one of them, where the goods are dual-use goods, but you have a reasonable belief, a reasonable and honest belief that they're being put to civilian uses. Because obviously things like avionics, there is a very good, and New Zealand has a very good trade, in fact, in its own avionics, and we don't want to suppress those kinds of industries. There are other areas as well that we were a little concerned about. Another one is where employees are acting, believing quite reasonably that their employers have taken care that they are complying with this regime and that there's no wrongdoing involved. Because obviously the trade in arms between sovereign states is an entirely legitimate function. We all recognise that. And if an employee is undertaking that in the belief that all the registration has been undertaken, there's absolutely no reason to intervene there. A couple of other things which were important was not only the registration process, which must be said is relatively light-handed. There's a fit and proper person test, but there's no great an onerous testing regime to make sure only the people of the utmost integrity, for example, like the lawyers' application process. But the other thing is annual reporting of activities. So anyone who is engaging in brokering activities in New Zealand is required, and this was an innovation at Select Committee as well, is required to report those activities. So not only do we require registration of the brokers themselves, but we also require reporting of exactly what brokering transactions were undertaken. And that's important as well, because it gives us a knowledge, a visibility about the size of this industry in New Zealand, so that we can trace and track what's going on. So we've got a whole lot of defences in there. We've got some jurisdictional improvements. and we've got an approach which is entirely consistent, and in fact, it's something we can be quite proud of, goes beyond what the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty requires. It extends it beyond guns and tanks to dual-use goods to make sure that not only are we not supporting an illicit arms trade, but we're not supporting an industry for the manufacture of illicit arms as well. So with that, Madam Speaker, I commend this bill to the House.
Speaker.
I call the Honourable Mark Mitchell.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a pleasure to take a call on this, the brokering weapons and related items.